Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to run through a quick demo of adding SMB shares on a server and connecting to those shares from a client. I'll run through the packages required for both client and server, doing the basic configuration on the server side, and then methods of manually mounting on the client as well as mounting automatically. I'll mostly stick to basic configuration options and touch on permissions. I'm not going to get too in-depth or talk too much about advanced configuration concepts. If you'd like to see a more in-depth video on working with Samba SMB shares, let me know in the comments. SMB is the default file sharing protocol used by Windows. I'm not going to show any examples from the Windows side. Depending on the authentication method, so long as you have the appropriate credentials, connecting to or from Windows shouldn't be an issue from Linux. If you really want to see that side of it, let me know and I'll include it in another video. While NFS protocol is frequently used on Linux for file sharing, sometimes you may need or want to work with SMB shares. In my experience, SMB on Linux works pretty well. I'll cover NFS in a future video. SMB is short for server message block, which you may also see referred to as cifs or common internet file sharing. Cifs refers to an older implementation of SMB protocol that's now deprecated. Everything should speak the latest SMB version, which is currently 3.1.1, and is what should be used unless there's a specific circumstance that requires legacy support. In order to facilitate SMB server functionality on Linux, I'll need to install the Samba package. In addition to file sharing, the Samba package provides functionality to allow Linux or Unix type systems to operate with Windows print services, which is also facilitated by the SMB protocol. Samba also contains components that enable Linux machines to function in Active Directory environments. For those that don't know what Active Directory is, it is the Microsoft implementation of LDAP, which is a protocol used to store a directory of information used to provide centralized authentication. Some other things can be used with that database, but I'll just leave it there for now to keep it simple. LDAP is pretty complex, and that's a pretty high level description. So the focus of this video will be on sharing over SMB. And so on the server you want to share from, or that you want to set up as your file server, you'll need to install the Samba package. And for Debian, you can do that with sudo apt install Samba. With Samba installed, you should see the SMB service running. And with the basic setup I'm going for, I really only need to work with this service. It needs to be restarted after making changes to the smb.conf file in the etc directory. So here I have from my client, I actually have an SSH session open to the server so I can perform configuration there. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and open the file manager here. And I can find the default shares by using other locations and then entering the smb:// and then the IP or host name of the target host. And so in this case, I'm using the IP. If I had a host file entry or DNS configured with this host added, I would be able to browse by name. But here we can see that the shares are discoverable, or at least the default shares here. And so that is when the browsable setting is set to yes, and we'll see more of that later. So with the default share showing up, we know that SMB is functional. The print $ share is for printing services. The nobody share also appears, which I did a little bit of digging on and found a couple of results related to others posting about it. One user noted that it appeared after upgrading Samba from 4.13 to 4.17. Doesn't show up on my Raspberry Pi, which is running the Bullseye variant, Debian 11, which is the previous version. So it's running an earlier version of Samba, and I don't recall seeing it before this. So I'm not really sure what's causing it to show up. I didn't see anything documented or find a complete explanation skimming through the Samba docs, but it's possible I missed something. I'm just pointing out here to let you know there's nothing to be concerned about if you do see a share that shows up as nobody. So let's check out the configuration file. And so the default configuration file has some examples and explanations related to configuring Samba features. I trimmed those out, leaving only active defaults. So if you're following along, your initial config will look a bit different than mine. There are multiple sections in our configuration file, some of which are special sections like global, home, and printers. Additional sections can be added to define shared resources, which we'll take a look at in a bit. There are a lot of parameters listed in the smb.conf man page, which are labeled with a letter to represent which sections of the configuration file that can be used within. Read through the parameter section of the man page for a full explanation. I'll run through a few of the parameters as I'm going through configuring, but I'm going to skip over some things and focus on a simple file server configuration. The global section controls defaults as well as the server as a whole. Defaults in this section can be overridden. For example, if browsable is defined here at the global level with a setting of yes, I'll have to explicitly declare it under another section or resource and set it to no in order to override. So starting with some of our parameters here, we have workgroup. If you're familiar with Windows, you've probably seen workgroup before. You can just leave it at the default unless you really want to change it. The computers you want to share resources with should all use the same workgroup name. And then log related to settings, which I'm not going to cover here, along with panic action. The path here points to a script that is called if SMBD or NMBD services crash. Server role, in this case, we're set to standalone, which defines how we authenticate and is required for our purpose of running a basic SMB file server using local authentication. Otherwise, there are multiple options that can be used here. Related domains or centralized authentication, which we don't need to worry about for this example. Then we have multiple authentication related settings listed here. I'm not going to go over most of it. One thing that does need to be discussed is that Samba has its own password file. There used to be a PAM module to configure syncing the SMB password with the local Unix password using the passwd command. It was deprecated for security reasons. I'll come back to this again later and demonstrate adding a user to the SMB passwd file and setting the SMB password. Here we have this map to guess setting, and this determines how to handle login requests that don't match a valid Unix user. In this case, bad username means if an invalid password is rejected, unless the username does not exist, treat as a guest login mapped to the guest account. There are other settings that provide stricter security, as well as settings that apply in specific authentication methods. I'm going to leave it at the default for the simple configuration. The last setting, user share allow guest, is related to user-defined shares. Samba can be configured to allow users to create and manage shares. I'm not going to cover it in this video, and instead we'll save it for a future video if I do decide to do an advanced configuration video. Moving to the home section, this section contains configuration that allows users to connect to their own home directories over SMB. The nice thing about this configuration is that it works when users are added without the need to perform any additional configuration. Comment will allow you to provide additional info about a resource. Browsable, which the default is set to no here, so we'd have to specify the share in order to see it from File Manager. So for example, to find the share, we need to do a / server name or IP and then slash and then the share name. Like we saw before where I was able to just enter in the SMB : / and then the IP. Those shares popped up, they were discoverable. In this case, if it's set to browsable no, it would not automatically be discoverable and we'd have to put in the share name. Read only, which is set to yes by default here. It's not what I'm going to want as far as my configuration for this server. So I'll want users to be able to make changes to their home directories, and I'm going to set it to no so that users can make those changes when connected over SMB, which I'll get to a little later when we actually demonstrate that configuration. So here we also have create mask and directory mask, and those are permissions applied when creating files and directories. Keep in mind that these settings are applied when working over the SMB connection. Logged into the SMB server directly on the console or remotely over SSH will result in the UMask setting or any special ownership permissions applying as configured on the server. Valid users, a space-separated list of users allowed to access the resource. Groups can also be added here by prefixing the group name with the @ symbol. Here it's using the %s placeholder, which is defined by the man page as the current service, if any. I tested it out by creating a connection from File Manager from the client side to the server, which creates a new SMBD process running as that user. So the username of the process is what we're getting here. The rest of the sections are related to printing. I'm not going to cover printing in this video, but if you're interested in some print configuration, let me know in the comments. I do want to point out that one setting in the print section that can be applied elsewhere is the guest OK setting. If set to yes, then no password is required to connect to the service, so be aware of that from a security perspective. Okay, so that's the configuration file, and we'll come back to it shortly and make some adjustments to work with home directories and define a new share. So before users are able to access shares, I need to add them to the smbpasswd file and set their password. Remember that our SMB password is different than the Unix password. As mentioned, there used to be a way to sync from the user's local password, which was removed for security reasons. If centralized auth is being used, it's easy to set it up to sync up correctly because the back-end password database can be used to authenticate user logon and share access. I might revisit this and dig into it and see if I missed something and include it in an advanced video. But for right now, I don't see a one-to-one replacement for local auth to sync those passwords up. So here I'll need to set up the SMB password. So use the smbpasswd command. And then we get prompted twice. And so the A flag allows us to add a user. And without any arguments or options, that will allow you to reset the user's password. So now that the passwords are set and the users are added, they'll be able to access Samba shares. A standalone configuration as set up in this video to add a user to the smbpasswd file. The user must already exist on the server, so they'll need to have an account in the local cifs-utils file. I created our directory ahead of time and set ownership and permissions. And so we're set up like this on this side. And also keep in mind that when we're using local auth like this, GIDs and UIDs on the client must match the IDs on the server. In this case, the GID on the server and the client is 1002. So going back to the configuration, I'm going to add my definition for our test share. And here the share name is listed in brackets. As we've seen before, the name doesn't have to match the directory path as defined by the path parameter. Technically, I can name it anything. For example, I could name it share and then I'd enter //10.99.0.69 /share. I'm not going to do that here because I think it's easier to keep track of the names when they match, but just so you know, you don't have to name it exactly the same as the path. Force group setting will ensure that objects created on the share are owned by the specified group. Before we restart the service, I'll test the config. So let me go ahead and exit out of the file here. And here we get services loaded okay. So we're all set here. We can dump all the config in the file. You can also run test parm without the path and include a -v, and that will show you all of the settings applied and all the defaults applied. You'll see a lot of settings that aren't defined in the configuration file that do have a default. You'll also see a lot of settings that have no default setting and that are blank to begin with. So if you are looking at a weird issue or something like that and trying to figure out some kind of default behavior, that's a good option to check out what's going on by default. And so since our configuration file tested without any errors, I'm going to go ahead and restart the service. And then let's check out File Manager here. And now we see our new share is browsable and we are able to access it from here. So I'm going to go ahead and try to access it. And I'm just going to do it this way so I can switch around and so that it won't remember my creds. And I'm going to go ahead and just create a test. I'm going to back out and I'd like to connect as a different user, and then as a different user, and then let's check out our directory here. And we can see that our permission settings applied as defined in our share definition. And so I have another user here I also want to demonstrate that has access to the share, but doesn't actually have any access to log onto the server. Just to demonstrate that real quick, we can see that this user shouldn't be able to log in. So back from File Manager, make a connection to the share again. And so it's another way that we can work with accounts where we don't necessarily have to allow access directly to the server, but we can still share files out. So now let's take a quick look at homes and configure that. And so now that I've set read only to no, users will be able to make changes in there so they can write to files and create new files. And so let's check that out from File Manager here. And so if we check x80 nix, and there's my home, that's the test file I created there to mark where we're at. And we can create directories within there, and we'll go ahead and disconnect from there. And so we'll test with Bob, but real quick here, just to show you that it is not browsable. So we will need to actually enter in the IP or host name, and then the direct path to the directory we want to reach. In this case, Bob. Put in Bob's credentials. And now we're able to reach Bob's home. And Bob can go ahead and create in his home directory or delete or change files. So far, the demonstration has used the graphical file manager, but the command line tool smbclient can be used to work with shares. So let's go ahead and check that out real quick. And we can also specify -u with the user, and then we'll be authenticating as a different user when we try to connect. We also see it provides a different user home directory because the %s placeholder under homes in smb.conf. The IPC share also shows up here. Without getting too in depth, this is used for some network protocol related communications, including SMB. There's some security related concerns with this share, but configuration can be applied to mitigate those issues. That's moving beyond the scope of this video. And when I suggest aiming to achieve best practice, this is obviously a greater concern in business type environments. The $sign on the end typically means it's a hidden share. Depending on the tool used to connect, it may display these hidden shares by default, or there may be settings that show hidden shares. Depends on what you're using. So the SMB client command actually has quite a bit of functionality, which I'm not going to cover in depth here, but I'll do a quick example. So a quick demonstration, it has the ability to copy from a share. And so in my home here, local to the client, I have this file here. And so with the SMB client command and then the path to the share I'm targeting, -c for command. And we can get a directory listing on the share. And so if I want to run the put command and the target file, I can run it like this. And if I check again, I can now see that the file has been copied over to the share. And I can also pull files down from the share this way using a get. And right there, I have my get file. And so it also includes an interactive mode. The interactive mode can be specified using the service name or server and share. I have a local file right here. And then if I enter the command like this, now I have an interactive prompt here. I can print my working directory and list out the directory. And also run help to list my available commands here. And if I run this command, and now I can see that I've copied the file over to the share. So files can be copied to and from, and there's more functionality available. Feel free to check out the SMB client man page to learn more. Shares can also be mounted if the appropriate tools are installed. By default, the mount command does not support SMB, so a helper will need to be installed. And so let me just exit out of here. And in this case, the cifs-utils package will provide what we need to mount the share. I already have it installed here on the client. So once we have the helper installed, we can go ahead and either use the mount command to mount SMB shares, or we can add it to our fstab. And if we wanted to put it in our fstab, it would look something like this. And so for a quick review, first we have the share path, then we would have the local path, then we have the file system type, and then we have our options. And this includes a path to a credential file, which we'll talk about in a little while. But the rest of these are going to be options that apply to how it's going to mount. But instead of mounting using fstab, I'm going to go with adding it to the user's profile, mount it automatically when the user logs in. Just in case the user connects to the host again, I'll have it set to do a check and skip mounting to avoid an annoying resource is busy error. You might get that if you SSH into a host you're already connected to, something like that. I also added a line in the bash_logout to unmount the share at logout. When checking mounted items, I noticed that it was still mounted even though I'd logged out with another user. So we'll add that. And so now I've provided a rundown of the method I'm going to use to mount it. Let's check some of that out. So I've already added the credential file. And there's the current credential file for this user. But just as an example, if you wanted to add one here, this is what it would look like. You replace your username there and your password with your password. And then common practice is to change the permissions so that only your user can read to it, and then there's no group or no other permissions for it. And I've also already added commands for this to the profile. So if we check out down here is how I've got this set up for mounting. So I could probably clean up what we're grabbing here as far as the value we're storing here, but I was just running through something quick and getting it to work. And so what we have here is it's saying if this value is empty, then go ahead and run this command, and then I'm clearing it here. By the way, the options here are just some of the available options for mounting SMB shares. If you want to see what else is available, check out man-mount.cifs. Also, to keep permissions in line with our server, the dir_mode and the file mode options pretty much match what I have set up locally on that side. There's different ways you can do permissions, and just depending on what you're trying to do and what kind of environment you have the share set up in, that's going to kind of vary widely as far as how you might apply that to reach your goals there. And so with this added to our profile, we'll now automatically mount at login. And so let's just check out that logout real quick here. And so the way I set this up is it's actually calling a script here. And so to check that script out that it's calling, And the reason why I did it this way is because we're using sudo here and we're using some sudo rules, which I'll show here shortly. But basically when you're running with that, it's who these commands run as far as some of the variable stuff. And so it wouldn't pull my regular user, so nothing would happen here. And so this variable, the sudo underscore user, when you're running commands like that, that will actually give you the user that is running the command. So that's why we're doing it that way. And so to check out those Sudoer rules real quick, I have one that will allow unprivileged users in the group to mount the share here. And it is a little broad. Again, this could be cleaned up and could probably be tightened down, but this is just kind of throwing it together real quick. And so then the ability to run the script as root so that we can run the unmount command. Again, this might not even be the most practical way to do it, as far as the login thing. I just want to do something a little different than, aside from throwing it into fstab. There's probably like 5 different ways we could do this. So, and then in those 5 different ways, there are variations within that we could do here. This is just kind of did not do the same boring old thing. I'm sure it has some of its problems when the share is not available, but anyways, that's how I did it here. So let's just check out what happens here real quick when we change to bot. And it looks like everything's actually there and available. So we know it's working when we log in. And then let's just see what all is mounted on the system. And it looks like we're cleaning it up and unmounting it as part of the script. Of course, if we're not strictly on a terminal and have a desktop environment, we could just do what we did earlier and mount it in File Manager and tell it to remember the password forever or even for the entire session. There's a lot of Samba SMB settings that weren't covered here, but this should get you started with the basics of the client and server as far as SMB shares go. If you want a more advanced SMB tutorial, let me know in the comments. And that's it for this one. If you found this helpful, please do me a favor by subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on the video. Thanks for watching.